Please be aware that this episode contains descriptions of domestic violence. This content may be disturbing to some listeners. Welcome to our podcast, Was Justice Delivered? Your go-to source for interesting, provocative, and in-depth legal analysis. I'm your host, Dror Bikel. In this episode, we're going to hear stories of courage from two women, my clients, Danny and Marie, who were at one time victims of terrible emotional abuse and physical violence perpetrated by their husbands, and who are now strong and fierce survivors of that very same abuse. These two incredible women are here to share their harrowing and inspiring stories. Before we begin, listeners should know that we will only use Danny and Marie's first names to protect their privacy. We will also not share the names of their husbands nor children for the same reason. It's important for listeners to also know that their husbands have unequivocally denied the allegations of abuse against them, and that for both men, there has been no final legal determination that either of them committed acts of domestic violence. With that said, Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Dror, and Myriad. A pleasure to be here with you.
Marie, thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dror, for doing this and for having me and for bringing light into this very terrifying but important subject. And Danny, thank you for joining me in this journey.
Danny, we're going to start with you. Tell the audience, where are you from originally?
Well, a little bit about me. I come from a country in Southeast Europe, brought up in a very loving family. However, grew up in a society where domestic violence, unfortunately, is indeed quite prevalent. Not as part of my upbringing or childhood, but overall in the society I grew up.
It's part of the culture of that particular society?
Very much so, very high prevalent and well accepted, unfortunately, in society. Not outright spoken, but in behavior, very much accepted.
How old were you when you moved to the United States?
I moved to the United States when I was 17 years old to pursue my education.
And at that point in your life, had you ever experienced any violence at all?
Never. As I said, it was quite prevalent surrounding. I grew up in a unstable political environment and saw a lot in the country, but I was never subject of physical or emotional abuse.
And how old were you when you met your husband?
I initially met him when we were at the tender age of 16. We began dating upon my arrival in the United States.
So you met him in your home country or you met him in the United States?
I met him in my home country. We're both from the same home country and went to the same high school.
Okay. And why did you come here?
Well, I came here in pursuit of the American dream. I wanted better life for myself, good education, and I wanted to be able to carve my own path in that pursuit of the American dream.
How old were you when you and your husband got married?
We got married, we were both 26 years old after having dated for 8 years.
You dated while you were both in the United States?
That's correct.
So you knew each other for 8 or 9 years before you got married?
Yes, indeed. Yes, we did.
During that period of time, was there anything, looking back now, that should have given you pause?
Well, frankly, there's a lot of things that should have given me pause. And frankly, there were things that did give me pause. There were moments when I consciously had to stop and ask myself if this made sense. Yet, as the case in many instances of domestic violence, we do fall prey to the pain that our husbands have gone through, our partners have gone through. And I was part of that. So I oftentimes justified those actions by empathizing with the pain that he had experienced. So I allowed for plenty of excuse along the journey. So the red flags were always there. I can't even tell you that I didn't know them to be as red flags. They were indeed red flags and I could label them. Yet somehow I made a deliberate decision to forgive and move forward because I could so uberly empathize with his journey.
If you could just love them enough so you could heal them.
Is that where you felt, Danny?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I could not have said that better myself. If they could only experience that love, right? If they hadn't before, if I could give that to him, then he would see the light and he would not behave like that.
Tell us what were some of those red flags.
I think the red flags begin as verbal abuse and this affinity for utter possessiveness. So with my husband, he was very, very concerned of, I kind of laugh now, but of my great physical appearance apparently in his eyes. And he wanted to very much make sure that that didn't attract other people's attention. So a core red flag was that he wanted me to dress a certain way in a very, very conservative manner. And I really couldn't understand it. That's not how I grew up. Yet his plea was, well, this isn't that important to you, but it is to me. Why wouldn't you do it to me if you love me?
Because he was scared other men would be jealous if you dressed in a certain way. And he was insecure about that.
Absolutely. And for the first couple of years, this changed along the way, but the first couple of years, he wouldn't want us to even go at the beach, even together, right? Out of this, sheer protection of my physical appearance and not being shown to the public.
Did you go to the beach in your home country? I mean, is this something that...
Yes.
So you didn't grow up with this kind of conservative attitude?
Absolutely
not. Did he grow
Yeah.
up with this conservative attitude?
No, he did not.
All right. So this is something that happened while you were together. He just wanted to keep you a certain way.
Yes, and it was specific with me. He didn't necessarily have those notions about other people.
Okay. So it was a controlling mechanism for you.
Hindsight.
Yeah.
2020.
And what other red flags were there?
The verbal abuse was very, very well thought out and deliberate. It was always intertwined initially into the praise, right? So it would come as, look, you're great and you would be even more amazing if only. Right. So those little things.
You're almost there, Danny. You're almost there, but you're not quite. Only if you did this, that, and the other thing, then you'll cross the finish line.
That's correct. And that's how it starts. And I want to identify that very clearly because day one is not, you're stupid. Day one is not, how can you live with yourself being that dumb? That's not how it all starts. It starts very tactfully intertwined into praise. There comes the punishment, and then it begins building up on you, right? And starting to
you start to believe it. Yeah. So can you give us examples of things he said to you?
He would say things like, you're doing great in school, but really when you think about how bad you are in math, right? It's kind of astonishing.
Right.
That look at your GPA.
Right.
It's
like a subtle put down there.
Yeah, we were in high school, right? So these are our early examples and the initial signs. So, and then it just continued to get worse and worse from there.
Were there acts of physical violence before you got married?
There were acts of physical violence right before we got married, with the prime one being him hitting me in the back of my head because I had left the cupboards in the kitchen open. I just really want to emphasize that the cupboards in the kitchen open warranted me being hit in the back of my head, followed by immediate denial that that's not what he meant to do and that wasn't it. And then me remaining utterly confused whether that actually even happened to me. I just remember sitting in between the kitchen and the living room saying, wait, is this real? You
Right.
begin to question your own reality at that point.
Gaslighting. It's just gaslight. He's like, he hits you for whatever reason and then denies it. It's like crazy making. He's trying to make you crazy. And then I'll call you
It's
crazy.
also control. Danny, I had a similar incident in the kitchen. It's interesting. It wasn't the cabinet being left open, but I moved the Gatorade from one shelf to the other. So he hid my heart medication until I would move the Gatorade back to the shelf, because it's not even that you left it open and it was a mistake. It's the control of it.
Yeah. And isn't it important, right, to talk about these for people to know these are not acts of small. They're building blocks towards a path of continued and greater abuse. That's why it's important to emphasize the small acts.
Yeah.
Even though the abuse got more egregious, these small acts are what people to know. Yes,
Yeah, they
do.
matter. Absolutely.
This is the conditioning. This is where the conditioning begins.
Yeah, that's right. The desensitization.
And it's also almost like they're testing, how far can I push it with you?
Yeah.
But it's so subtle, and they just it builds.
Right. So you got married. What were you feeling like when you got married on wedding day, given this history and also given your love for him? What kind of emotions were there?
There's such complexity of emotion, right? I obviously and very clearly loved my husband. And I wanted to marry him. I wanted a future with him. But I can't tell you that in the back of my head, there were not plenty of concern of how our marriage would come to fruition and move forward. I had seen the behavior. But again, what superseded it all, this utter hope, was this utter hope that things indeed would get better, because I relied on my strength and in my capacity to love him just enough so this would not continue.
You could fix it. You
could
could love him to heal him.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And I relied so much on it. And, but it obviously, as we know, it doesn't work. And for those that are listening, I want you to know it doesn't work. You can't love them into healing. They have to want it for it to happen.
What happened, Danny, after you got married? At one point, you had children. So how long were you together before you had your first child?
So I am fortunate enough to have two amazing, beautiful children out of our marriage. Between my husband and I, our marriage had plenty of beautiful moments. I have to sit here and tell you that some of my amazing memories are out of this very marriage that we're discussing, where harrowing domestic violence occurred. So we had peaks and valleys. We had beautiful times when it was just he and I before the children came to life, and very, very disturbing times where the violence continued to escalate even before the children were born.
So, Danny, let's talk about that. Tell us what happened. You get married and you have some really good times. I think you guys travel and some work-related stuff. Graduate, you're getting jobs. You're both very, very successful and intelligent and high-achieving. And so you have good times and successes. But tell us about some of the hard things that happen.
My husband and I, we were on this journey of conquering the world together. Here you have these two young kids coming from an impoverished country, making our way into the United States and building a dream together. So here we were, band together in our pursuit of careers, in our pursuit of life, building wealth, finding a home together to buy, all of that journey. And along the way, what was sprinkled in it is many times of frustration poured onto me, whether it be verbally, emotionally, and oftentimes physically, where he would just have these outbursts of anger, that moment of, I go from all is well to that moment of, do I fear for my life based on what I see in your eyes? So
you were that family on social media that you see as like the perfect family with like the perfect vacation and the perfect kids. But behind that, there was this darkness. So Danny, tell us some of the things that happened to you before you had children, before you had your first child.
the signature move of my husband was this open palm, open hand, and the clenching of the teeth, and him proceeding to hit me in the back of my head. I call that his signature move because I could not recount how many times that happened. I, on the physical abuse side, recall him hitting me on the side of my face and hurting my ear so bad that my ear became blue, and him saying that he didn't mean it. That's not what he meant. That type of blunt trauma to my ear was a mere accident. And I knew deep down that wasn't the case, but I wanted to believe it so desperately.
Yeah, you couldn't admit. You're just too painful to admit what was happening in your life. It's too painful. Yes. It's too hard to admit it.
I think also when you yourself are an empathetic, kind person, we try to think the gaslighting we internalize, but it's also, we can't imagine that anyone would actually have that kind of cruelty where they would mean it. It's hard for you to accept that about another person, especially one that you love.
Yeah, you can't wrap your brain around it.
Yes.
No.
And I don't know, Myriad, if this was your story, but for us, if you would ask any of our friends what the ideal couple would be, they would choose us. Really, we had it. Externally, we had it. And look, and much of it, at least on my part, was real. We loved each other externally speaking, right? And I don't know that wasn't indeed the case, but that did not mean that violence was not occurring, because harrowing violence was occurring in our lives behind closed doors.
Danny, wasn't there an incident where he spit at you that you had told me about and that was part of your court proceeding?
Yes, that actually happened before we were even engaged, just in our dating years.
What happened?
And it is actually the first act that involved a physical component. He did spit at me, and I was shocked. And I immediately said, "This is it. We're breaking up. It's over." I had such clarity of mind in that very second. And he came back begging and saying it was a stupid mistake. It was just meant to be as a joke. There was no ill will into it. It was stupid, stupid, stupid. And if he wishes he'd never done it, and he'd take it back in a second, and he pled to be forgiven.
And you forgave him?
I forgave him. I forgave him.
And where did he spit at you?
In my mouth.
And what was your reaction when that happened?
Stunned. And I had still the strength and the will to say, enough, this is over.
Right.
In that very moment. Yet what comes after is all the pleading, right? It's the coming back. It's like,
that's the pattern. He does something and then either it didn't happen or he begs your forgiveness. There's always some sort of shift to get back into your good graces. Different strategies. One strategy is, you're crazy, it didn't happen. And another strategy is, please, please, please take me back.
Yes.
And for the most part, it worked. And it works on a lot of people. I'm going to turn over a little bit to Mairead now, because you have also a fascinating background. Mairead, where are you originally from?
I'm from Westchester, so I'm from right outside New York City.
How old were you when you met your husband?
I was 32. Yeah, I was in graduate school. We were both in graduate. He was about to start grad school. I was in. And so I was 32. He's about 5.5 years younger than I am.
Where did you guys meet? In the city, in Manhattan?
We met in the city. Yeah, we met actually in a bar. I was out with a friend and he looked very grumpy, as my friend said. So I had a silly band, one of those funny bracelets, because I work with children, and I gave that to him to cheer him up. Foreshadows a lot in our lives.
And what is it foreshadow?
As Danny had said, you're always trying to heal the person. You're always trying to make them feel better. He looked grumpy that night. He was tired. He told me he had just gotten back from deployment. He's a combat veteran. So immediately I just found him fascinating. I was in grad school for psychology. So I thought, wow, this guy has quite the story.
Yeah, he's extremely intelligent, isn't he?
That is what really attracted me. He is so smart. He's genius level.
And
really.
also, Danny, your husband is extremely intelligent.
He is indeed one of the smartest people I've encountered. Yes, very intelligent, always did great in school, and very disciplined around his career.
So, Mairead, how long did you and your husband, then he was your boyfriend, how long were you together before you got married?
We were dating about a year, and then we moved in, and I told my parents we were moving in. And my dad, this is totally out of character because my parents are very supportive, very loving. And he said, "The heck you are moving in," because I am Irish Catholic. And he didn't say heck. And so then he said, "You have about a year," because my sister is my best friend and her engagement was very long. And he said, "You have a year to live together. If you're not engaged by then, I'm going to talk to this man," whom they like. My family is so close. I wouldn't have dated someone they didn't like. But again, he's very intelligent. He was in graduate school, a very nice grad school. He was really great on paper and nice to my parents because my parents are wonderful. It's hard not to be. And so he made my dad's deadline. He proposed within like just under a year, like a month under a year. And then
Were there any red flags? Tell us how that year was.
Many.
Were there good things and were there bad things?
Many. There were great things. I mean, he was, always up for doing things at first. It's funny because a lot of the things I loved about him when we were dating are things that were used later to torture me, really. There was an incident where he really was very disrespectful because, what abusers do is they isolate their victims. And he did it so subtly. So he would find out what would bother my friends and then do it right in front of them. Whether it was my friends or before we moved in together, my roommate.
Like what? Give us an example.
The biggest example is actually disgusting, and I should have left him. He had this offensive t-shirt company because it was a military thing and they thought they were very funny. And he was wearing a t-shirt that my friends debated whether or not it was anti-Semitic. I had a lot of friends who are Jewish. And so my roommate at the time was converting to Judaism. And she said, "I don't like that t-shirt. I really don't. I don't find it funny." And he wore it again in front of her and even pointed out like, "Hey," and one of my friends had said, "It doesn't actually, like, of course it matters whether or not it's offensive, but what we really need to look at here is that she said it bothered her and he wore it anyway, and that's a disrespectful thing." And that is him in a nutshell. I didn't see it and I didn't want to see it because I thought, his excuse always was, "Oh, well, your friend hates men anyway. Oh, this person, she has problem with men."
It's disrespectful to your friend, but it's also disrespectful to you. Isn't that the real point?
Yeah, because...
Right, because your friend. Yeah.
It's my friend, and it made it very uncomfortable for me. I didn't like the t-shirt either. I mean, talking about someone in grad school, offensive t-shirts, I'm in grad school for psychotherapy. So it was an incident that should have been more of... And we discussed it. At the time, I thought we were talking. He understood things. He would stop doing things for a time. And when we were living together, our biggest argument was the treatment of my cats. He was really cruel to them. He would go through times where he loved...
How many cats did you have?
I had 2 cats, and they were adorable and the light of my life. And he was really, really cruel, but then he would be so sweet with them too. He would do little dances with them and they'd have songs.
How was he cruel to them? What did he do to them?
When we first lived together, if they did something, like, they were toilet trained amazingly, and if they would poop on things, he would basically waterboard them. He would soak them, and then their paws would get bloody trying to get out of the sink. Later, when we were living together, and in the early days of throughout our marriage, he would do things like if they were loud, because they were loud cats, he would put a sock over their heads. And then it progressed to putting a sock over their head, putting it in a backpack, and putting the backpack in the closet. He would call it their mute button.
And this happened while you were living together?
It progressed. When we were living together, it was mostly the waterboarding. And
Right.
as Danny said, you make excuses. I thought he was kind of like of mice and men. He's a big guy. He didn't understand, you have a squirt bottle for cats. He didn't understand you can't use that much water. I mean, looking back, it's absolutely ridiculous that I didn't run then. But at the time, I kept thinking, well, he just, he's a bit rough around the edges. I can help with that. He came from a lot of trauma. He had a very difficult family life. He had been at war. So I thought, okay, this guy, he's fascinating. But as I said with Danny, if you just love them enough, you can heal them. And then I realized later in my marriage, I was starting to become someone I didn't want to be when I would fight back. And that's when I really thought, okay, I need to hold on to who I am.
I'd like to know what you felt like on your wedding day, given what happened, but given your love for him, all those complex emotions, like what were you going through?
So my wedding day, my brother-in-law brings that up often because like 2 days before my wedding, one of my friends got confused about the rehearsal. And so I sent out the wrong information. And he sent me an email cursing me out and it was really horrific. But as usual, I thought we can smooth this over. We can work on this. We're nervous about the wedding. He was triggered by being with his family. He was always meaner when he was around his family. So we went to dinner. We talked about it. By the rehearsal dinner, he'd also said mean things about my dad, which was out of nowhere. I thought he loved my parents and they were so amazing to him. And so our wedding...
That's part of the isolation, part of removing you from your supports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he would physically pull back. It was neglect that he would use more than anything. If he was upset with me, he'd stonewall me. And so then I was always thinking, oh, it's something I did. I could just, I just need to talk this out. I need to work this out. And it should be noted, again, I said my parents were wonderful. My mom's a psychotherapist too, and had come from her own complicated past and is the most, my family, my parents and my sister are the most amazing people ever. My sister and I talked about this. We were kind of raised to think therapy can solve so much, that you can come from,
you can fix them.
You can fix it. And so on my wedding day, it was a beautiful day. It was beautiful. We had all of our family and our friends. It was the perfect weather. It was an amazing day. And that day seemed fine. The lead up to it was really, but yeah.
It's interesting, though, that progression to be noted, right? Around initially, they do love the family. They do embrace your friends. And very slowly, the friends become stupid. The family becomes losers, at least in my case. So there is this evolution from, okay, I embrace them. And all of a sudden, everybody in your life, something is wrong with them.
Exactly. And what was interesting, again, with my friends, I have a lot of single girlfriends. I mean, I was single in New York City before I met him, and they were all man haters. And I learned later, was suspended from undergrad for lying in an academic incident. And his excuse was, oh, that professor hated men. She hated male athletes, and that's why. And it was the same pattern of, oh, yeah, that friend just doesn't like me because she hates men.
Blaming other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And projection, because he has a real problem with women.
So after you got married and you continued to live together, there came a point when you had a child.
Yeah. And that
the light of your life.
Oh, she is the most amazing person I've ever met. She is so good and kind. And so I risked my life to have her. I was born with a congenital heart defect, so we knew it would be risky. I lost my mom right before I got pregnant, and so it was a difficult pregnancy. And the abuse really started, especially more of the physical abuse, started, it wasn't like Danny's story where it was, and Danny, just hearing it, I'm so sorry. And for me, it was more sporadic, and it started out so subtle with he was a hockey player, so he kind of almost like checked me into a corner and pushed me. He pulled me off a ladder when I was pregnant, and then it escalated when I found out he was cheating, and I found out some really horrific things he was doing, which I'm not happy to share, but I think it's an important, terrifying to share, but an important part of this story. And I discovered them, and he, when I was pregnant, shoved me off the bed, held his fist in front of my face, and because I was upset, I think I pushed him over a little bit. I was pregnant. He had kicked me in my chest that night and held his fist in front of my face and said, "That is how you incite violence." And I ended up in the hospital that day. I thought I was going to lose our baby.
That's him knowing that you have this congenital heart issue and you had trouble getting pregnant, and you ultimately, thank God, you got pregnant. You were able to get pregnant, and now with this congenital heart disorder, you're carrying your child. So it's a very, very sensitive time for you physically. And this is what he does. He pushes you, he puts his fist in your face, literally in your most vulnerable time.
Yeah, and it escalated. He did subtle things and not so, and aggressive things like that. The subtle things like not leaving enough time to get to something, so I'm running. I'm extremely high risk, and working on his bike constantly with the chemicals that would make me vomit.
So you had a small apartment, a relatively small apartment, and he's got a bike in the apartment, and he's using chemicals to clean and oil or whatever he's doing to service the bike. And you're pregnant and you're sensitive to the smells and it's making you nauseous. And did he agree to stop?
Oh no, he would do it more. It was, and it should be noted at this time he wasn't working. He stopped working before I got pregnant. He kept saying he was meeting with recruiters. He was trying to get another job. But here I am, high risk pregnancy, going to work. My doctors wanted me to stop working, and he said, all right, he had quite a bit more money than I did, even not working, and said, okay, then you're still going to have to pay for your part of the rent. So essentially made it so I couldn't stop working, even though it was the doctors had said you should. So he did everything he could to make sure it was the most difficult pregnancy ever.
And like injection of that type of difficulty, I mean, that is the means of control. That's exactly what the message is there, right? It's how they assert their power over you. Right?
Yeah, he would use financial control a lot. By the way, the getting pregnant, I had trouble because of him, and he was lying about certain things he was doing. He was using medication that disrupted our ability and lied about it. So this was a miracle pregnancy, given all of the barriers. And then when I went to go have our child, I almost died. It was the closest I've come to dying. I had to be in the hospital for 2 weeks. I went into complete heart failure. And he barely came to the hospital after she was born. He was great during the birth. I have to say that. He was absolutely wonderful during the birth. And then after, again, that neglect, he just stopped coming to the hospital.
Did you later come to learn how he was, because he wasn't working at this time. So how was he spending his time? Where was he?
So when I was 7.5 months pregnant, I discovered that he, this is the terrifying part to divulge, but he hires sex workers, and he's very into BDSM. I discovered before I was pregnant that he was cross-dressing. And again, I thought, that's when he agreed to go to therapy for a little while, but wouldn't tell the therapist anything, wouldn't divulge about any of this. So throughout my pregnancy, when he was saying he was going to meet recruiters, he was actually going to hotels to meet sex workers. And the kind of porn I discovered he was watching and the kind of sex acts he was engaging in were humiliating and violent and horrific. And the number one thing he requested of these women was that they wear schoolgirl outfits. And so, that's, we have a daughter, and he was role-playing being a predator in these horrifically violent and humiliating sex acts.
And you found this out before you gave birth?
I found it out when I was 7.5 months pregnant, and then that's when I went into heart failure. So it was hard then because it was shocking. I mean, one of the cardiologists said to another friend of mine who also has a heart condition, he said, that was the most terrifying moment of his medical career. It was a scary time. My daughter is my miracle baby. I really fought hard to survive for her.
And having represented you in the courts for some time, I can say that both of you are the fiercest when advocating for your children. There's no question about that, Mairead and Danny. Danny, we're gonna shift back to you. Was there an incident? Did something happen? At some point, you got out of this relationship. Tell us what happened and what you were feeling and how you got out.
Yeah, so I somehow convinced myself that I could handle what he was doing to me because I had the strength and I had the compassion for him and his pain. And also I had my 2 children to raise in a way that I thought was right for them to be raised, which is in a home with both parents. So I endured the violence towards me, including hitting, choking, passing out and left unconscious and getting back up. But what I could not continue to endure was once I realized the violence had gone past me and into our daughter, then 5.5 years old, it was clear as day. There was no more questions in my head, and despite the love and compassion that I had for him, the path was clear ahead, and it was just a matter of making the plan to get my children out. When I was with him and he was violent towards me, I felt this utter responsibility to save him. But saving him could not supersede saving my children. And it was at that time that once my daughter told me what he had done to her, it was time to make that plan. And I did. I asked for help from a psychologist at the time, carved out the plan in a way that I would be safe. He had threatened in the past to kill me and the children if I dared to leave. So I had to be really, really careful and deliberate. And on that January 11th day, I took both of the children. I packed our lives in a suitcase and left to start our life to safety.
What were you feeling on that day?
I was as scared as one can imagine. I just recall saying my last goodbye to him. I put my hand on his chest. He didn't know I was not coming back. And I just said goodbye. I was scared. But I had a purpose. It was the purpose that showed me the way. I can't tell you that at the time I felt strong. I wish I could. I didn't. I was weak. I was terrified. I still had love for him, but I had a responsibility to my children. I looked at them and, not out loud in my head, said, "This will not be your story. This will not be your life, and Mama will make sure of it." So I was scared but determined. I was scared but determined.
That's incredible. I want to talk to you about the legal process, but before we get into that, Mairead, was there an incident that happened with you and your husband where your daughter was also present that also initiated you leaving your husband?
Yeah, it's interesting, Danny, listening to you talk. There was what should have, looking back, happened when my daughter was 2 months old. My first Mother's Day, my husband drew me into a wall head first and caused a major heart head injury, but also my heart. And my doctor had called me about an hour later and called me throughout the day, very concerned, thinking I had an arrhythmia. My husband could have killed me, and he was well aware of that because, again, I was in heart failure. And that was when my daughter was 2 months old. But
I mean, at this time, Mairead, let me just, I'm interrupting, but I just want to set the scene. You have equipment on your body monitoring your heart.
The heart
I mean,
monitor,
it's not like you're just resting because, you have a heart condition, which is serious, but you actually have this serious monitoring equipment on your body.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was sent home from the hospital with a life vest, which is an outside defibrillator. But I didn't have that on, thank goodness, because it would have shocked me that night. I had the heart monitor strapped to my chest or attached to my chest. So they knew right away something happened. They thought, again, I'd had a near fatal arrhythmia, but it was actually my husband wearing me into a wall. And I had such a bad head injury. I did go and see my primary care. I didn't want to take my 2-month-old to an ER, but I waited and went to my primary care that day. It was really bad. I mean, it was so bad. People were commenting that foreshadows what happened then when she was 3.5. It's so interesting, Danny, hearing you too. Like we don't consider the violence against us. Somehow it's, oh, you've been convinced that you deserved it or you caused it or it was something. And I did leave my husband once right before my daughter was 2 because I didn't like who I was becoming. I was screaming back at him. And that's not me. I'm calm and kindness is important. And I left him for 6 weeks, but I returned because my dad was dying and I just couldn't, one, financially, but also just, I couldn't emotionally handle a divorce and my dad dying at the same time. So I went back. I thought I could solve things always. And then I ended up filing for divorce because my dad did die and my husband left like right after the funeral to go biking. And for me, that was terrible, but for our daughter to just have 2 men in her life disappear.
Wasn't there an incident with the cat?
Yeah, so
Another incident.
This is a year after I had filed. He's promising he'll get better. He'll go to inpatient. He's going to get help. And then I wake up the day after my birthday.
So you filed for divorce, but you're still living together.
We were still living together because he was still making promises he was going to get better. And
you were believing him.
I believed him, and I thought, I pulled every professional and personal string to get him help, and he just ignored it. So the watershed moment was not even, it was when the day after my birthday, I woke up and the cat's meowing. And again, he had not been kind to them. And he said something about the cats waking him up. I heard it happen, cat meowing, and then there's a thump, and then there's silence. He had thrown the cat against the wall, and I thought she was dead. So having to scoop up that limp cat from the bathtub was a watershed moment for me, and then having her bleed from the mouth. So I immediately brought my daughter and the cat to the emergency vet. And the vet I told the vet what happened and asked the vet to check the cat's head. After they had done, it was a code blue, so they did work on the cat, and then he came up, asked what happened. So the vet had already seen the cat. And so I described what happened, and he called the police. He's a mandated reporter. And when the police showed up, I was terrified because I worked so hard not to anger this man. And I knew this was going to make him very upset. And that's when he got kicked out. And again, we were already
That's when the legal process started and he was removed from the home.
Yeah. Well, we had already been in divorce court, but that's when I got a stay away order and he was removed from the home. Yeah.
An order of protection.
An order of protection.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to talk about the legal process a little bit. The legal process, as both of you know, is very, very slow. Things take a lot of time. You both have been in the courts for several years, particularly you, Danny, but also you, Mairead. And now you're both kind of towards the end of your case, the end of the proceeding, but it's still going. Danny, let's start with you. So we've been to court together probably dozens of times over the years. What has the court process been like for you? What's it like going to court, preparing for court? What do you feel before, during, after? What's it like?
Honestly, it's one of the hardest things to do is that getting ready for court. For whatever reason and whatever the case may be in front of us, it's just so difficult to be in front of the judge and listen to these proceedings and be part of it. And very importantly, knowing that his presence is there. The court process has been grueling. And oftentimes I do think what happens to people who don't have the strength, the support around them from family, from good attorneys, what happens to those people? How many times do I think about them? You have no idea. I just do wonder, because if this is my story, with the love and support that I have, with the ability to speak up now for myself, to have the type of legal support that I've had, and if this is my journey, what happens to those who don't have it? I oftentimes think about it. But needless to say, 5.5 years later, here I am, not yet done, still to this day, fearful for my children's lives and what could happen out of certain decisions to them. To this day, 5.5 years later. So here I am, I stand, and then I hear women's stories who stayed, and it was revealed that they allowed violence in front of their children and to their children and lost their children. So oftentimes we find ourselves in this very no-win situation. There is a harrowing battle ahead if you dare and leave, and there is the fear of you lose them forever if you don't. And I don't know, we put victims of domestic violence in a very, very, very difficult situation. So again, to summarize, a grueling process, a very difficult one that's basically required everything that I have, financial, physical, emotional, intellectual, to be put into it just to keep my children safe.
And at this point in your case, your husband's parenting time, well, your husband doesn't see your daughter, and he has supervised time with your son, and you do have an order of protection.
Yes.
There are legal protections in place for you, but understandably, you still feel vulnerable. You still feel scared.
I absolutely do. And Dror, out of all people, you know what it took to be in this situation and all that we had to do to show how important it is for my children to be protected.
Yeah, it's been a long process, but I will say that the courts and the judges, and there's been multiple judges that have addressed your family and your situation, Danny, and I think that the courts have heard you. I do feel that. And that's not because of us, it's because of you. I think your perseverance and your voice, I think, has been heard. Unfortunately, the process is very slow because there's just so many cases that these judges preside over. So it's just, there's a real kind of backlog in the system. But when you do go to court, and we've been many, many, many times over the years, I do feel that the jurists, and there's been several, they hear you. And the legal process has had your back until now. You're still involved, so I don't want to say going forward, but your husband's still fighting, isn't he?
Yes, indeed he is. I mean, it has taken a village. I do feel very, very fortunate, right, to be in a situation where my children are protected. And frankly, I hate to say this, but given the fears that I have and the threats that I'd received, we're all alive. I mean, it's so sad to say, but we're alive. And I was told that if I did this, and I did do this, that we wouldn't be. And yes, the courts did their work to ensure that today, 5.5 years later, both my children and I are alive. And there's been advocacy for my children through representation of them and getting their voices heard. It's been grueling, but you're right. We're alive today.
And Mairead, tell us, what's the process been like for you? I haven't been with you the whole time. I came a little
Right.
later, about a little over a year ago. But what's the process been like for you?
It's been horrific. So I think an important thing that Danny was saying is that when we leave, and you've heard both our stories, it wasn't for us, it was for our children. Like, I fully believe when the cat, by the way, was in an oxygen tent for weeks after what he did, and ultimately died about a year later because she never got better. He threw me against the wall. He threw my cat against the wall. I did not want my daughter, whom he had done really scary things around, to be next. He had put her in situations that could have really put her life at risk. And that is what gave me the strength to leave. But I hear from a lot of women, I don't want to leave until my child can at least talk. And it's terrifying. It's when you leave, it's the scariest, because then you're in the hands of the court. And we know the truth, but it's so hard to make sure that our children are going to be safe when we're not there then to protect them. At least if I were there, I could take the brunt of it. But now if I'm not there and he's with her, so far, thankfully, we've had supervised visits. I'm fine with them, having supervised visits. That I have not only not ever stopped that, but I've done a lot to facilitate that, whatever I could. It's the unsupervised and having her be in danger that is really terrifying, because the criminal courts really dropped the ball. They really failed us. Not only was he arrested because of the cat incident, but he also violated his protective order several times. He was finally arrested when he tried to sneak into my building. It was on video. The doorman stopped him in the lobby. They positively identified him. So he had 2 counts. He had the violence with the cat and then violating the protective order. And I had went through 3 assistant DAs, and there was a lot of blame about the courts being backed up and the laws changing. And the ADA that finally got the final case said, that they did fail us, that he was not prosecuted, and they said, we'll give him 6 months. If he keeps his nose cleaned, it'll get expunged. And then he didn't. He sent me emails under the guise of giving me this IRS check, but he pushed and pushed to find out where I or my sister lived. And it violated his protective order. And once again, he wasn't, like, all of those things together showed how dangerous he was. This is a man who, when we were still together, once told me about having the itch to kill, and then said, oh, this homeless guy on our corner, better watch out. He knows where he lives or where he sleeps. Like, this is a very dangerous person who terrifies me. The criminal courts did nothing about it. I sent them email confirmation that this man hires prostitutes to do these violent, humiliating acts. That is illegal too. And they did nothing. And I am afraid of the impact going forward that's going to have, because for one thing, now he feels, rightly so, that he's untouchable, that he can do these things and there are no repercussions. And what's that going to look like for our child?
That is indeed what the issue is, right?
Yeah.
Through the process, they do get the ability to continue to be emboldened with their actions, because they do get away with it. I mean, and the thing is specifically to the court process, I fundamentally believe anybody who is a civil servant is there because they want to do good. Like, that's just, it's a belief that I have. However, there is a sense in which that the way that the process is designed, it's a bit of the checking of the boxes with a particular ultimate end in mind, which is this connection, equal connection to both parents. And while that is a fantastic notion when there's 2 healthy parents, one of which is not dangerous, however, in the cases when one parent is indeed dangerous and presents danger, it becomes a checking of the box. Has enough time passed where they haven't done something outrageous during supervision? Well, these are not stupid individuals. Of course, something is not going to happen during supervision. The system, it's not necessarily the individuals in the court system, the system itself is really built towards this notion that no matter what, this is the ultimate outcome, versus the ultimate outcome being safety of the child, no matter what, with 100% certainty.
Exactly.
That's such a great point, Danny. And I know both you and Mairead are experiencing this, which is that the law and the courts want to promote and foster the relationship between the children and their parents. Judges are constrained by that, and they want to promote that relationship. That's their job. On the other hand, that's weighed against acts of violence. And I think you both have expressed to me fears of what's going to happen when this supervision is over. You're both petrified about it because the likelihood of permanent supervision is small. It's a reality. Your husbands are going to have, and they're going to be your ex-husbands, are going to have unsupervised time. And what is that going to look like? And those are things that I know keep both of you up late at night.
All night. Yeah. Plus, in my case, there was a solid year when there was absolutely no in-person communication and barely any FaceTime. There have been months and months that go by where he doesn't contact our daughter. He wasn't that involved when we all lived together, when we were still together. He really wasn't. Again, neglect is one of the things. He's left her alone in our apartment, unsupervised. He's left her unsupervised in his dad's house that has an unfenced pool when she was 2 years old. He was supposed to be watching her and went out on a bike ride. He's not shown very much care for human life, for one thing, but for our daughter. And so I feel like, why force someone to be a parent who has not shown a real want to it? He can turn it on when people are watching him in a supervised visit, and absolutely when and act loving and doting, but then it's terrifying. Like I was telling you, Dror, one time when he was just in he's pushing through me with his bike, and I looked and there was nothing in his eyes. He had dead eyes. Yeah. He was not seeing me. I was not a person. He was seeing through me. I saw no one. And it's terrifying that there is that capacity of just, there's no one there.
Yes. And for me, what is also a little bit puzzling is that I have 2 children, one of which has been subject to domestic violence. And there's a little more relief around her. But there's this notion that somehow he, my husband, will behave different with a second child, that somehow what he did to our daughter, he's not going to do to our son. This is the same person, the same individual who continues to not take any accountability of action. I have no idea how I can justify it to myself that he is not going to do the same to our son as he did to our daughter. And that's very difficult. But there is this sense in which, at least by the process, that if a second child was not directly harmed, hence, other measures can be taken, or not the same measures can be taken for that second child.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and I'm talking about someone too who, floor to ceiling, 23rd story windows, he would hide the child safety locks from me because he wanted the window open more when she was a toddler. And there's, as Danny said, there's no accountability. There's no going back and realizing you did anything wrong or apologizing, because I think that's where we struggle and what kept us there as long. It's so hard to, again, wrap your head around it, to give up hope, to give up the hope that maybe they'll change. And it's so wild to think someone could be so unapologetically cruel. I did not know people like this existed in the world. And to expose your child to that cruelty is just, it's horrific.
I think what's challenging for both of you is that whenever we go to court, and it's been years now with both cases, what we don't hear is a sense of responsibility and accountability, even if it's, as we say in the profession, off the record, right? It doesn't have to be in front of the judge, or it can be in another fashion without any admissions of, legal liability. This idea of, Mairead, I'm sorry what I did. It was wrong. I've been working on myself. I promise to do better. Danny, I'm sorry. I screwed up. I'm sorry. I've been working on myself. I have a therapist. She specializes in working with people who are batterers. And I'm not just saying this, like, you can speak to the therapist. In fact, I want you to speak to the therapist and tell her, what I did to you. So that kind of like taking responsibility just isn't there in what happens in court. And that's part of what's embedded into this process, is that it's adversarial. And so in their minds, I'm imagining, I don't know for sure, but I'm speculating, in their minds, what happened was, not the worst. She's over-exaggerating, making a bigger deal of it than it was, and she's weaponizing custody against me. So in their minds, they're fighting to see their children, and in your minds, you're protecting your children from them. I think that it would go a long way if they would tell you in some capacity how sorry they are and how willing they are to get treatment and to help themselves. And the fact that that hasn't happened just means the trust just isn't there.
I agree, but I don't think that in my case, it's fighting to see his child, sadly. I think it's fighting to win. He loves the art of war, and he has told me that if you punch him, he's going to punch you back 10 times harder. And I think that he sees this as an assault against him that I left, and how dare I. He was very controlling, and this is punishment.
He's the victim. He sees himself
pain.
As the victim.
He's always the victim, and he's going to cause pain to whomever he can in order to try to hurt me.
And I would agree with that. I mean, with my husband, he clearly stated to family members that his goal was to render me homeless. And this isn't about our children, unfortunately. If that was the case, I think his behavior would be very different and very much along the lines of what you were describing, Dror.
Mairead, what advice would you give somebody listening to this episode, somebody who's in this situation of being a victim of domestic violence? What advice would you give?
I think I'm obviously biased, but therapy is so important. Really gather your support network and hold on to your support network, and don't lose a sense of yourself. I mean, this is hindsight is 2020, but hold on to that support network. Don't lose your voice. Trust your instincts. Trust your gut. See those red flags. It's so hard, but I understand the fear, and your support network, surround yourself with people who understand that, and give yourself some grace, and make sure that those around you give you grace.
That's such a great answer. What about you, Danny? What advice would you give people?
Well, before I go to the advice, the very first word that I would say to somebody in that situation is that I see you without being right there to see you. I see you, and you are not here because you're not strong. You're here because you are strong. It is the strongest of us who believe that we can deal with this and help these men in our lives get through. You're here because you are strong, so I'm here to remind you of that, even though you don't feel it right this minute. Gather your network. I double down on that. The people around you, you're going to need them. And if you're afraid that you're going to lose friends in this journey, don't be. I've lost none. I've just realized who they are. That's all. So this is not your fault. Be strong. Acknowledge your fear and let your courage hold that fear's hand as you look forward, because there is a better path for you. Life is long and life is beautiful. You, my friend, have the strength to get through this. Not because I'm promising you it's easy, but I'm promising you it's worth it. For you, and if you have children, for your children.
What a beautiful, beautiful answer, Danny.
Sorry, can I just add one thing? Because Danny, I just wanted to say, Danny, you reminded me when one of my mom friends was moving out of New York, and she knew what was going on, some of what was going on. And she gave me a hug and she said, "You're stronger than you think you are." And it was so important to me. But we have to also, the other advice I would give is, you are worth it. We protect our children, we protect our pets, but we deserve that. And it is a hint at what's to come for your children and others. So when it starts with you, make it end with you.
Mairead, one last question. Do you believe up until today, justice has been delivered in your case?
Criminally, no. But with family court, I am terrified of what's to come. But so far, with the supervised visits, with what's happened, for the most part, yes.
What about you, Danny? Do you think to date has justice been delivered in your case?
I share that very same sentiment. Today, yes, I do. We're here and we're safe. That does not mean that I'm not scared. I'm very scared for what's to come.
Danny and Mairead, thank you so much for this incredible conversation from two courageous, powerful women that have been through just terrible, terrible incidences of domestic violence, who have come forward to share their stories. If you or someone you know are victims of domestic violence, we encourage you to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.